The Hebrew Bible contains many interesting and supernatural creatures, one of the most mysterious of these being the Nephilim, first introduced in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim are described as heroes of old, men of renown, but the identity and origin of the Nephilim are still surrounded in mystery to this day. Some call them demons, some call them giants, but to find out who the Nephilim truly were and where they truly came from, I journeyed deep into the scriptures, and what I found out about these people is much more fascinating than I ever expected.
Well, Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4 is a difficult text. And as we attempt to interpret it, we should be humble because there are different interpretations that have been taken of this text. And I don't think that whatever interpretation we take, I don't think we should be divisive with other Christians in the church or among the people of God. There are three, Genesis 6 says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they chose the daughters of men for themselves as wives, and they married them. So the question is, who are the sons of God that are marrying the daughters of men? Well, there are three different interpretations. One is that the sons of God is a reference to the godly line of Seth. Cain killed Abel, so after Abel died, Adam and Eve had relations, and Seth was born, and Seth carried on the godly faith of Abel. So one idea is that the sons of God are the descendants of Seth marrying the daughters of men, the ungodly line of Cain.
Hi again. I want to talk to you today about the Nephilim. This is going to be a biblical look at the Nephilim. The Nephilim are also mentioned in the book of Enoch. And we're going to not even look at the book of Enoch at all because many people don't believe the book of Enoch is canonical. So we're going to look at what the Bible says about the Nephilim. And we're going to prove the Nephilim existed. And we're going to see their origins and some of the developments that happened because the Nephilim were on the earth. I've seen some false teachings come out about the Nephilim, so we're going to straighten out some of those false ideas that are out there about the Nephilim. Like some people said that they didn't exist after the flood. Well, the Bible says they did. And we're going to look at those verses now. Really, the whole story of the Nephilim starts with the judgment of Satan, because the Nephilim were Satan's weapon to try to destroy the seed of the woman. And that's because God told Satan that the seed of the woman would crush his head. When God pronounced judgment upon Adam and Eve, he also pronounced judgment on Satan. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, and the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, because you've deceived Eve, and thus caused Adam and Eve to sin, because you have done this, you are cursed above all the cattle, above every beast of the field, and upon your belly you shall go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of your life. And then verse 15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So here we see that Satan is going to have seed, and we see that the woman has seed. Now the woman's seed obviously is all human beings. All human beings came from Eve. Eve was the mother of all the living. So when he tells the serpent, when he tells Satan here, between your seed and her seed, he's telling us something. He's telling us there's going to be people on the earth that are not of the woman's seed. And those are the Nephilim, because that's when angels came and took wives of human women. And those were not her seed anymore, because men came from women. When men and women created descendants, they were mankind. So her seed was mankind. The seed of Eve was mankind. So God was talking about Satan when he said your seed and her seed. He's talking about Satan's seed. And it says, it shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. If we look at verse 15 in the NIV, it says, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers offspring. So the man's offspring, man and woman's offspring is the woman's seed. Satan's offspring is the Nephilim, and we'll see that when we get to it. he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Now, Satan struck the heel of the seed of the woman by crucifying Jesus on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, that was Satan striking at the heel of the woman. That wasn't a victory, that was just striking at her heel. But the seed of the woman, he, here referring to the seed of the woman, will crush your head. He says this to Satan. He tells Satan how his end is going to come. When your head is crushed, you're killed. So here Satan is told how his end is going to come. It will come through the seed of the woman. He, the seed of the woman, will crush your head.
See, the word Nephilim, a Hebrew word meaning the fallen ones, only appears in the Bible 3 times. First in Genesis 6 verse 4, second in the book of Numbers, and third in a secret lesser known passage in Ezekiel. Based on these passages alone, we can't conclude much about the identity or origin of these creatures, but what we do know is this. The Nephilim were a race of giants. In the book of Numbers, the Israelites are on the cusp of entering the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a symbol of abundance and plenty. But there's a problem. There are several Gentile nations occupying the land, enemies of Israel. So Moses elected 12 men and sent them out as spies into the promised land. When exploring, they reached the land of Hebron, where they came across 3 important figures, Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Upon returning home, the spies reported about the men they saw to Moses. Caleb, one of the spies, spoke up and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them."
Second interpretation is that the sons of God refers to angels, angelic beings, intermarrying with humans. The third idea is that the sons of God are heroes from the mythical past, tyrant kings. We have stories from the ancient Near East, for example. We have stories of a person by the name of Gilgamesh, and he was part god and part human and accomplished many mighty feats. So how do we find the right interpretation? The exact expression, sons of God, only occurs 4 or 5 times in the Hebrew Bible. We have one occurrence here in Genesis 6. We have 2 occurrences in the introduction to the book of Job. In the introduction to the book of Job, we see God gathering in his heavenly court, his heavenly assembly, with the angels. The angels are called sons of God there. There's another occurrence in the book of Job, Job chapter 38, where God is challenging Job, and he says, "Where were you when I created the world?" When he created the world, the sons of God sang for joy. So it seems to, it also seems to be a very clear reference to angelic beings. The last occurrence is in Aramaic in the book of Daniel. When the king looked into the furnace, he saw four people there, and it says that one looked like a son of God, which would mean a divine being, an angelic being. There are only 5 occurrences in the entire Bible where we have the exact expression, son of God or sons of God, and it always refers to angelic beings. We must distinguish this use from other places. There are other places in the Bible where they indicate that the relationship of a human to God is like a father-son relationship. So Adam and God have a father-son relationship. In the covenant that God makes with David, God and David have a father-son relationship.
So Satan is told here that the seed of the woman will crush his head. So obviously, what is Satan going to try to do? He's going to try to create his offspring. And his offspring have to exist in order for there to be enmity between his offspring and the seed of the woman. Now, moving forward to Genesis chapter 6, starting at verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them." Okay, notice here that women, daughters, were born to men. Okay, so this was still the seed of the woman it's talking about here. When men and women were multiplying on the earth, it came to be that the sons of God, the angels, saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So here we see that Satan's plan was to create his own seed. Because remember, there had to be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of Satan's seed. That means he had to have seed to begin with. This is how Satan created his seed. He had his angels. The sons of God here are the angels. The angels saw the daughters of men. See, this is telling you the sons of God are not men. They saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. So men and women were multiplying on the earth, and the daughters of men were fair in the eyes of the angels, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Well, what happens when you take a wife? Children. "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also his flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So here we see that 120 years from the time that God said this, the earth was going to be destroyed by a flood, or all life was going to be taken off the earth except for Noah and his family. So we see there was 120 years from the time he said this. So it doesn't say here that God has said anything to Noah yet at this point. It says at this point in verse 3, God said, "My spirit will not always strive with man, for he is also his flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." Now I want you to notice something that God said here in verse 3. It says, the Lord said, "My spirit will not always strive with man," and this is man as in Adam, mankind, "for that he also is flesh." Also. Now who else is he talking about? The sons of God saw the daughters of men were fair, and they took wives of all which they chose. So when God is saying that his spirit will not always strive with man, and that is talking about Adam, man and women, Adam and Eve, their descendants, "for he also is flesh," he's talking about also because he's referring to the children of angels and men who are the Nephilim. "He also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So here we see that the problem was that Satan was corrupting all the flesh on the earth. It says in verse 4, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown." So here we see that the giants that were on the earth were the Nephilim. The NIV here says the Nephilim, and that's actually the correct translation for these giants. You see, the word here is Nephilim. That's the word that is translated giants in the King James. It tells us plainly in verse 4, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them." So here we see that how the Nephilim were created was the sons of God, the angels, went to the daughters of men and had children by them. That's the Nephilim. That's who the Nephilim are. When the angels had children by the daughters of men. Those are the offspring of Satan. Remember, God said he would create enmity between Satan's seed and the seed of the woman. The Nephilim were the seed of Satan because the angels were disobeying God. They were told not to take wives. Jesus tells us in the New Testament that the angels are told not to take wives. They are not supposed to get married, and they broke that commandment of God. And the result was the Nephilim. They were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Now here's the key. Also afterwards. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. So that means the Nephilim were on the earth after the flood. And we'll see that in a minute. Verse 4, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them." Now, very importantly, it says they were the heroes of old, men of renown. These were powerful and they were giants. Now, it's no coincidence that right after this, In verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Well, wasn't it interesting that that happened after the Nephilim came into existence?
The descendants of Anak, otherwise known as the Anakim, were a race of people descendant from the original Nephilim. Whenever the Bible refers to the Anakim, they are associated with large stature, great size, or mighty strength. The people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to the sky. And moreover, we have seen the sons of Anakim there. A people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Who can stand before the sons of Anak? These people, along with other races of giants like the Rephites and Emim, dominated the land until Joshua and the Israelites utterly destroyed them with their cities. We can safely say that the Nephilim were a race of giant people, but the mystery only gets deeper and more twisted when we ask the question, where did the Nephilim come from? To answer this, we must return to the first appearance of the Nephilim in Genesis 6, 1-4, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The most commonly held view of the Nephilim's origin is that they are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of humans. But the meaning of these two terms is hotly debated, especially the term sons of God. The phrase sons of God appears in the Hebrew Bible a total of 5 times. The first in Genesis 6, the second, third, and fourth in the book of Job, and the 5th in the book of Daniel. The appearances in the book of Job all seem to have one thing in common. The sons of God here seem to be some kind of angelic beings.
But it doesn't say that, it doesn't actually say that Adam is a son of God. It doesn't use that linguistic expression, and it doesn't say that David is a son of God. So the only time that linguistic expression occurs in the Bible, it always and very clearly refers to angelic beings. We also have the witness of the New Testament. So there are 2 passages in the New Testament that refer to this. One is 2 Peter chapter 2, and the other is the book of Jude. And both of these texts are very closely related to each other. In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter is talking about how difficult days are coming for the Christians, and there will be people who deny the faith, who deny the truth about Jesus Christ, the truth about his work, who deny the gospel. There will be false teachers, and they will bring corruption into the church and destruction into the church. What Peter does is he appeals to the Old Testament, and he says, well, if God could deliver his faithful people in difficult times in the Old Testament, then he will be able to do it in the New Testament as well. Peter refers to 2 examples in the Old Testament. One is the story of of Genesis 6 and Noah, and the other is the story of Lot being rescued from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you look in the Greek text of 2 Peter, it's very clear that there are 2 examples and not 3 examples by the use of the word and. So if God did not spare the angels who sinned, and he delivered Noah, and he did not spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he rescued Lot. So there are 2 examples joined by the word and each example has 2 parts, a negative part and a positive part, a negative part and a positive part. So when Peter is talking about the angels who sinned, he's very clearly talking about Genesis chapter 6 because this is connected with the story of Noah. Some people say, well, no, he's not talking about Genesis 6. Well, then my question to them is, if Peter is trying to encourage his readers from well-known stories in the Old Testament, and if the angels who sinned is not Genesis 6, then where else is the story? There is no other story in the Old Testament that it could be referring to. Some people think that it's the fall of Satan, but as we're going to see when we talk about that, there is no story in the Old Testament that describes the fall of Satan. Peter is very clearly alluding to Genesis 6. Jude is doing the same thing, and it's very obvious in the book of Jude because he's talking about people who are false teachers, people who are going to deny the faith, and he also appeals to the Old Testament and shows how God delivered his people in the past, and he will do so in the future. He also refers to two events. He refers to angels who abandoned their proper dwelling place, their proper home. He also talks about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, since they, in the same way as these, committed strange immorality. Well, in the Greek text, the they refers to the angels. And the same way as these, the these refers to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Now, men were not perfect in their own beings. They weren't perfect. Men made mistakes throughout all of time. But the wickedness here is catastrophic. Verse 5 says, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. And this was because the Nephilim came onto the earth and they affected the whole earth. Because remember, they were the powerful ones. They were the heroes, the men of renown. They were the heroes of old. They could overtake any human man. They were more powerful than any human man because they were half angel. But notice verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And verse 9 says something very important. It says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Now notice Noah wasn't perfect in his actions. It doesn't say that. He wasn't perfect in his actions. He was perfect in his generations. In other words, there was no Nephilim in his family line. As you can imagine, since Satan must have started doing this from the time after he was kicked out of the garden, and when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, he must have started this plan immediately after that because he knew he had to destroy the seed of the woman. He had just heard that seed of the woman was what was going to destroy him. So he must have immediately put his plan into effect and had his angels have daughters with human women. Noah here is the only one who was left who was perfect in his generation. So from the time of the beginning of when man was cast out of the Garden of Eden, Satan had been corrupting the flesh of all mankind. And every family line had some Nephilim in it. Every family line did, because Noah was just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. Now, in order for the seed of the woman to crush Satan's head, the seed of the woman had to exist. So God had no choice here but to destroy all of mankind and the Nephilim with them. But he had to keep the seed of the woman alive, and how he did it was through Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because he was perfect in his generations. He was fully human. There was no Nephilim in his family line. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In chapter 7 and verse 7, when it talks about how they went in the ark, it says, Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark. So here we see how the earth was going to be populated again, because Noah's sons brought their wives with them into the ark. Now we read later in Numbers chapter 13, and we'll start at verse 22, talking about the Israelites when they were spying out the land. It says in chapter 13 of Numbers, verse 22, they went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Now, who are these descendants of Anak here? These 3 are mentioned as prominent figures when the spies went up to Hebron. When the spies reported back to the Israelites, in verse 32, it says, they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw are of great size. We saw who? The Nephilim there. Now, who are the Nephilim? The Nephilim are when the sons of God, the angels, had children with the sons of men. That's who the Nephilim are. The Nephilim were there long after the flood. This is when the Israelites were spying out the land of Canaan, long after the flood. And it says, the spies say, we saw the Nephilim there. And then it tells us the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. Verse 22 says, they went up to the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Who are the descendants of Anak? They come from the Nephilim. Anyone who comes from a Nephilim is a Nephilim, because how did the Nephilim come to existence? By angels taking wives of human women. So we know that Satan didn't stop doing that after the flood. After the flood, Satan took right up where he left off, because we see that there are Nephilim there. They are the Nephilim. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. The Nephilim were destroyed during the flood, so we know that they had to be started up again.
The Daniel passage uses the phrase, a son of God, and is mentioned as the fourth person in the fiery furnace, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, alluding to some form of angel, some even believing an early appearance of Christ himself. So it seems like the sons of God referred to in Genesis 6 were angelic beings. But how were angelic, immaterial servants of God marrying and sleeping with human women? Jesus himself says in the Gospel of Matthew, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. Some people say that Jesus' words refute the theory that the sons of God in Genesis are angels, because angels can't marry. But the key is in the last two words of the verse, in heaven, implying that the angels in Genesis were fallen. The idea of fallen angels is supported by two very important New Testament Bible passages. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these angels, indulged in sexual perversion and went after strange flesh.
So what the story of Genesis 6 has in common with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that there's an abnormal form of sexuality going on. If God can deliver his people from even the strangest perversions, then he will deliver the people who are listening to Peter and the people who are listening to Jude. He will deliver us. Now, someone might come to me and say, well, Jesus in the Gospels says that the angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage. So it's impossible for an angel to have physical relations with human women. Well, they're not reading the Gospels accurately and clearly, because Jesus is saying that when in the resurrection, when Jesus returns at the end of history, we who are resurrected are not going to marry, because we're going to be like the angels in heaven. Notice he says the angels in heaven, and Jude says they left their proper dwelling place. So there's no contradiction between Jesus and Jude. In heaven, the angels don't marry. In Jude, they abandoned their proper dwelling place and they go to commit strange immorality. So there's no confusion. So it seems very clear. Genesis 6 is telling us that these are angels who are marrying humans, and Jude and Peter are telling us that is the correct interpretation. The next piece is, who are the Nephilim? In verse 4 of Genesis 6, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God had relations with human women, and they bore children of them. End of sentence. New sentence. They were the heroes who were from the ancient past, men of renown. There's two major sentences there. First one says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. There are two possible interpretations of this expression, they were on the earth in those days and afterward. What does that mean? They were there in those days and afterward. Well, some people think this means that the Nephilim were the children that came from the angels who married the women in Genesis 6, verses 1 to 3, and that the Nephilim were the product of these unnatural unions, and they appeal to texts from the 3rd century BC and 2nd century BC, the so-called Enochic traditions, the traditions about Enoch, where the Nephilim are interpreted as giants. There's another interpretation that's possible. When it says the Nephilim were there in those days and also afterward, it could mean that before the angels had sex with the human women, the Nephilim were there, and they were also there after the angels had sex with women. So it could mean that the Nephilim had nothing to do with the angels marrying the humans. I think that is the correct interpretation for two reasons. First of all, I examined every occurrence of this expression and also afterward. I went to the Hebrew Bible, I looked up every occurrence of this phrase, and I examined how it was used. And the second interpretation best fits and suits how this word is used.
At some time afterwards. So we know that Satan probably just took up immediately trying to destroy the seed of the woman again after the flood. 3 of those sons of great prominence were Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Enoch. But we'll see that there were many more than that. And in verse 33, when it says we saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim, it says we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Now that tells you how big these Nephilim were. They were giants. In Deuteronomy, in chapter 1 and verse 28, the Israelites said, "Where can we go? Our brothers have made us lose heart. They say the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there." Even. So this tells you that the Anakites were set apart. They were special. They were Nephilim. We even saw the Anakites there. But notice verse 29, then I, this is God speaking, I said to you, do not be terrified, do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes. So here we see that the way they would destroy the Anakites from the land, and thus the Nephilim, was to not be terrified, to not be afraid, and the Lord would do the job. He was going to fight for them. That was probably the only way they could destroy the Anakites. The Nephilim were half angel. So the Lord said he was going to fight for them. The Lord will fight for you. That's how the Israelites were supposed to overcome the Anakites. And why did God want the Anakites destroyed? Because what happens? When the Nephilim come into existence, what happened to the earth in the times of Noah? They took over. They basically took over. There was Nephilim in every family line. They were taking over the earth. And if they were allowed to continue in the time of the Israelites, they would have taken over all of the land that Israel ended up taking. It would have all been taken over by Nephilim. The Lord had to keep the seed of the woman alive. So the Lord was going to fight for Israel and help them destroy the Anakites, who were the result of angels disobeying God. They were not fully human. They were half angel, half man. In chapter 2 and verse 10, it says the Emites used to live there. It's talking about the Moabites. In the land of Moab, the Emites used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. So notice the Anakites are once again referred to as being giants. And the Emites were actually Nephilim. They were just called Emites by the people of Moab, because it says, like the Anakites, they too were considered Raphaites. And so Raphaites were Nephilim. So like the Anakites, we know they were descendants of Nephilim. So they too, the Emites, they too were considered Rephaites, but the Moabites called them Emites. So they called them Emites, but they were Nephilim. So the Emites were also Nephilim. Now, God continues here in verse 13. The Lord said, now get up and cross the Zered Valley. So we crossed the Zered Valley. And then in verse 18 says, today you are to pass by the region of Moab at Ar. When you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war. For I will not give you possession of any land belonging to the Ammonites. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. Verse 20, that too was considered a land of the Rephaites. We saw above that the Rephaites are Nephilim. So that was considered a land of the Rephaites being the Nephilim, who used to live there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzummites. So here's another reference to Nephilim. Verse 21, they were a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. They were Nephilim, Rephaites. Now notice what it says next. The Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The Lord destroyed them. Now we know the Ammonites were human, they were men. The Ammonites couldn't have destroyed these giants. And it says the Lord destroyed them. It doesn't say that by accident. There's nothing in the Bible that's said by accident. The Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. So that tells you that the Lord is the one who caused them to be destroyed before the Ammonites. And the land of the Ammonites, that was given to the descendants of Lot. So the descendants of Lot basically were used by God to drive out the Nephilim, who were Rephaites, who were called Zamzummites by the Ammonites. They were Nephilim. The Ammonites couldn't have done this. The Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites and drove them out and settled in their place. So the Ammonites were basically given that land because God gave that land to Lot. So the Ammonites were allowed to do a work of God by driving out the Nephilim, who were called Zamzummites, who were Rephaites. Rephaites were Nephilim. And the Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites. It wasn't the Ammonites, it was the Lord who did it. And we'll see that the Lord did it for Israel as well. If we go to chapter 9, now Moses is still talking here in chapter 9, and he says, Hear, O Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people there are strong and tall, Anakites. Now this tells you something very important about why the Israelites were supposed to drive these people out of the land and take possession of it. Because the Nephilim were there. That's why the Israelites had to drive those people out and destroy them utterly. That's why the Lord said, keep no survivors. He told them to drive the people out completely because they were Nephilim. God needed the seed of the woman to save all of mankind. He had to destroy the Nephilim. The Nephilim could not be allowed to flourish on the earth. So the people are strong and tall. Anakites. Anakites are Nephilim. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? In other words, when the Anakites took over, you couldn't stand up against them. They took over, just like the Nephilim in the times of Noah. They took over. Their seed would eventually take over if they were allowed to flourish.
They exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Knowing that some angels did in fact fall from heaven and breed with humans, it makes sense that their offspring would be different, resulting in the monstrous size and might of the Nephilim and the giants that followed generations later. Though it's the most commonly held view of the Nephilim's origin, there is one problem in the theory. Listen carefully to the phrasing of these words. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of mankind. Some have taken this passage to say that the Nephilim were already on the earth before the fall of the angels. This would mean that they aren't the offspring of the fallen angels and humans. In fact, some go as far as to say that the author of Genesis, Moses, is specifically mentioning the Nephilim alongside the fallen angels to highlight the separation between the two groups. One theory is that the Nephilim were descendants of Seth, the faithful son of Adam, making them fine warriors and men of renown. Another theory suggests they were simply a genetic mutation, which caused extreme growth. Are the Nephilim a race of demonic giants who terrorized nations for centuries, or were they simply large people? I'm not confident to provide the answer, so I want to ask all the biblical scholars, pastors, and teachers online where you think the Nephilim came from. Otherwise, these fascinating people will remain a mystery for the rest of time.
So when it says they were there in those days and also afterward, it means the Nephilim were there before angels cohabited with humans, and they were there after angels cohabited with humans. There's a second reason why this is the correct interpretation. The last sentence says they were the heroes who were from the ancient past, the men of renown. This sentence does not begin with and. Now that's very, very important. Almost every sentence in the Hebrew Bible begins with and. When a sentence does not begin with and, it does so for two reasons. It could be because it's beginning a new section, or secondly, because it's making a comment on the previous sentence, what we would call a footnote. It's very clear that this sentence is not beginning a new section, but it's acting like a footnote on the previous sentence. So the previous sentence is saying that the Nephilim were there before the angels and the humans cohabited, and they were there after. And it's making a brief comment that they were the ancient heroes. In this case, what Moses is doing is he's demythologizing the Nephilim. You notice, one of the things that we should notice is the text doesn't tell us who the Nephilim were. What does that mean? Why doesn't the text tell us who they were? Because they were well known to the first readers of this text. The first readers of this text knew who the Nephilim were and didn't need that explained to them. And all Moses is saying is, look, whoever you think these heroes are, like Gilgamesh, these ancient heroes, these men of renown, you've read about them in the ancient mythologies. Whoever they were, they're not part of this story. They don't come from the cohabitation of angels and humans. And I think that's the correct interpretation. But the problem is, this has been a difficult text to interpret. And it has not always been interpreted correctly down through the centuries. And in the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century BC, they came to an incorrect interpretation. They thought that the Nephilim were giants who were produced by angels cohabiting with humans. And this got into the book of Enoch. And Paul warns his readers against this because he says in his letters to Timothy, don't argue over endless genealogies and foolish myths. This is a direct reference to the book of Enoch, which has a long genealogy of all the angels until you finally come down to Satan, and then they blame all the evil in the world on Satan. What they're trying to do is they're trying to blame chaos and death and evil in the world on angelic sin instead of blaming it on human sin. And the Bible clearly puts the blame on humans. Genesis 3 shows how sin came into the world. We live in a world that is troubled by chaos, by death, by evil, by sin, by selfishness, by all kinds of corruption. That came about because God made a covenant with the first humans, and they broke that covenant. They were fickle, they were disloyal, they were unfaithful, they cheated on God in the relationship, and they rebelled against him. And so when Jude quotes and refers to this material, he's showing that the sin is in the world because of human rebellion, not because of angelic sin.
Thanks for watching Honest Answers. Don't forget to subscribe.
But notice verse 3. But be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them. He will subdue them before you. And you will drive them out and annihilate them quickly as the Lord has promised you. Now hold on a second. God drove out the Nephilim before the Ammonites too, we saw in a previous verse. Now we see that the Lord God is the one who goes ahead of you like a devouring fire, and he will destroy the Nephilim. He's talking about the people there who are strong and tall, Anakites. They are Anakites. They are Nephilim. And the Lord's telling them that he will destroy them. This is Moses still talking to the Israelites. And he's telling them that God will destroy them. In other words, they're not going to be able to do this. God will do this for them, just like he did for the Ammonites. He drove out the Nephilim before the Ammonites. God will destroy the Nephilim, and he will subdue them before you. Verse 4, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of those nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. This tells you plainly that these Nephilim are in rebellion. We know from the account of Noah that these were angels that were in rebellion against God. Satan's plan was to populate the earth with his own seed and to overcome the seed of the woman so the seed of the woman couldn't crush his head. So here we see that God is plainly telling them, no, it's on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. And it says, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, this couldn't be accomplished if the Nephilim were there, because the Nephilim would overtake regular human men. Now in Joshua, when they were actually taking the land, we see in Joshua chapter 11, in verse 21, it says, at that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country. Hold on a second. Who are the Anakites? That's the Nephilim. Who do you think destroyed these Anakites? You think it was Joshua? You think it was the strength of man that did this? At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir and Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them in their towns. Verse 22, no Anakites were left in the Israelite territory. Now hold on a second. The Anakites were Nephilim. The men had no chance against Nephilim. But here we see that God was fighting for Israel. That's how they overcame the Nephilim. It says in verse 22, no Anakites were left in Israelite territory. But notice the next part of this verse. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So there were still Anakites on the earth even after Joshua wiped out the Anakites from Israelite territory. There were no Anakites left in Israelite territory. The land that God gave to Israel, there were no Anakites there. But there were Anakites in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. In chapter 14, we see that Caleb, who was one of the spies who went to spy out the land, who had to wait for the whole generation of Israelites who didn't believe God to die off in the desert, Caleb went in and took the land that God gave the Israelites. He was one of those who gave a good report, and he went in. In Joshua chapter 14, verse 6, now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, that's one of the good spies who gave the good report, he went in and he took the land after the 40 years in the desert. And Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, you know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. What did God say to Joshua and Caleb? He said, you two will go in and take the land. All the other people who didn't believe me, they will not go into the land. And sure enough, they all died in the desert over the 40 years that they wandered in the desert. Then Caleb says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. That was a good report. He gave a report that God can give us this land. He saw that there were Nephilim there, but he said, the Lord will give us this land. So Caleb says, I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Verse 9, so on that day Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Then verse 10, now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since that time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. So he was 85 years old, and he was just as strong as he was when he was 40. And he says in verse 12, now give me the hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself, he's talking to Joshua, you yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. Now here we see Caleb's faith once again. Who was in the land that Caleb wanted to take? The Anakites, the Nephilim were there. And their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me. What did the Lord tell them through Moses? Moses said, the Lord will drive them out before you. And here Caleb is showing his faith in God. He says, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. So here we see Caleb is just as faithful to God as ever. He's still giving a good report. He's still believing God. And he's ready to drive out the giants, the Nephilim, the Anakites. Then Joshua blessed Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. And then notice verse 15. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba, after Arba, who was the greatest man among the Anakites, the Nephilim. Arba was the greatest among the Anakites, who were Nephilim. And Caleb took their land. In chapter 15 and verse 13, we see, in accordance with the Lord's command to him, Joshua gave to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, a portion in Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the forefather of Anak. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. So here we see the 3 Nephilim are mentioned again. Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Caleb drove them out. Those were Nephilim. Why? Because he was trusting God. God fought for Caleb. If we go back to Joshua chapter 11, verse 22, remember it said no Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So hold on. There were still Anakites in Gath? If we go to 1 Samuel chapter 17, we see in verse 4 a champion named Goliath who was from where? Gath. A champion named Goliath, this is who David fought, who was from Gath, came out from the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. So here we see that Goliath was a descendant of Anak. He was a Nephilim. David killed a Nephilim, and that tells you how great this victory was that David had over Goliath. It wasn't just any man. This was a Nephilim, half angel, half man, that David killed. And remember, he killed him by cutting off his head. A stone going into his forehead wasn't going to kill this Nephilim. No, he killed him by cutting off his head. Now, you'll hear some people say that there couldn't have been any more Nephilim after the flood, because you read in the book of Enoch how great the punishment was of the angels who left their habitation and took up habitation with human women, as it's mentioned in the New Testament. Enoch records that the angels were absolutely horrified by the punishment. The punishment was so horrible, it was beyond definition of how horrible the punishment was for these angels that did this. Now, some people say, well, see, they wouldn't have done this. after that. They saw this punishment, so they would not have continued with that plan. Wrong. Think about this. All the angels who followed Satan, they were doomed already. Satan knew he was doomed, and all the angels with him knew they were doomed. They knew their only chance was to destroy the seed of the woman. That was their only chance, because God said the seed of the woman would crush their heads. It would crush Satan's head. So how, just think about it, how would an angel prove to Satan his allegiance? He would take a human wife despite that punishment. People think from a human standpoint, and they think, oh, well, that punishment's so terrible, no one would want that. No, you can't think like a human being. You have to think like what an angel would have thought. Like if they knew they were doomed and Satan was their leader, would they do something that absolutely proved their allegiance beyond a shadow of a doubt? The only way they could do that is by taking a human woman. That would prove that they were willing to take the punishment that they saw other angels take who sinned at the time of Noah. But yeah, after the flood, the Nephilim continued. We see multiple accounts in the Old Testament times when Israelites were taking the land that there were Nephilim on the earth. It even comes out and says that there were no Nephilim in the territory of the Israelites. In other words, there were Nephilim in other places. David fought Goliath, and Goliath was from Gath. And Gath, of course, was one of the places where the Anakites were still there. So we know that the Nephilims continued to exist throughout the whole time of the Israelites, because remember, Israel was already a nation, and Saul was their king when David killed Goliath. And remember, David took 5 smooth stones out of the stream when he went to kill Goliath. He took 5 smooth stones. Why is that? He only needed 1 stone to knock out Goliath before he cut off his head. Who were the other 4 for? Well, wouldn't you know, Goliath had 4 brothers. And what would those be? If Goliath was a Nephilim, what were the other 4? That's right, Nephilim. So David was saying, you know, all 5 of them are going down. So that means there were Nephilim on the earth in the Old Testament times, even while Saul was king. And you know that Satan didn't stop with his plan. His plan was to destroy the seed of the woman. The only way to do that was to overtake the seed of the woman. The only way to do that was to corrupt the seed of the earth, to make people half angel, half man. Then the seed of the woman could not crush his head. But in the time of Noah, all the Nephilim were wiped out. Then again, in the time of the Ammonites were used by God. The descendants of Lot were used to drive the Nephilim out of Lot's land. And then we see that the Israelites were given the land where Nephilim were. They were given the land, and they drove out and destroyed the Nephilim that were there. And we see that there were some Nephilim that were left. But the Nephilim kept getting wiped out. They kept getting wiped out time after time. Why? Because God had to make sure the seed of the woman survived until Jesus was born. Once Jesus was born, Satan's had to change his strategy, because the seed of the woman's already here now. The seed of the woman already came and crushed his head. He's already lost. Satan knows his time is short. So anyways, yes, the Nephilim did exist after the flood, and the Nephilim are the children of angels and human women. That's who the Nephilim are. So that's my message for today. Thanks for watching.